So, yeah, I'd like to start, first of all, also by congratulating Mikel and Matteo and my colleague Camillo on producing this book, which I think, as Mikel was saying, the movement towards people-centered reconstruction, towards reconstruction that is based more on the needs of the residents, more on the needs of the affected people, is starting to take hold, and to have sort of very strong case evidence about how this is happening is a very welcome book. And I was asked to write a chapter on Turkey and on the role of community participation in reconstruction in Turkey. And it was not an easy chapter to write, this one, because Turkey is majorly affected by earthquakes on quite a regular basis, and the state has a very strong control over reconstruction, and reconstruction is usually done through contractor methods through the state. And so when you start to look at participation or even people-centered reconstruction, it's a very, very different approach to what is being done in the country at this period. So the question of scale, I think, in the chapter looks at sort of the small scale, what is possible to happen in a system like this, where the state has very, very strong control over the reconstruction and everything is planned centrally. And so in taking that, what I would like to do in the next 10 minutes is make one quite simple point. Mikel and I were talking last week about this, that I could maybe relate this to what is happening in terms of risk reduction, because there were some sort of small collective processes that were done after the earthquake in 1999 in Turkey that have manifested themselves now, 10 years later, in work that is in disaster risk reduction. And I think this is quite an interesting thing to look at, even though it's very small scale, to understand how people-centered reconstruction can, in the long term, and as Joe just mentioned, embed these skills within communities to make better development and to really to work on better building, better planning frameworks, etc. Just as a very basis, and I think we're all aware of this from the book, is that we have, and I'd like to make the distinction between participatory reconstruction and community-driven reconstruction. Very much what happens in Turkey is this contractor-driven reconstruction where everything is planned centrally. But there's quite a difference between this participatory reconstruction, as Joe was saying, where agencies assume the leading role and people are usually involved more in probably in construction, sometimes in design of some units, towards community-driven reconstruction where people actually have the full control of the building process and may not actually construct themselves. And in thinking about how reconstruction can lead to longer-term risk reduction, how it can lead to either collective processes or to better building. And the title of the book, Building Back Better, I think rebuilding aims to improve development and thus also reducing the risk to future disasters. So there's a link in this, whether it's safer building, whether it's better livelihoods, whether it's more say in governance processes. There's a lot of ways that rebuilding can aim to reduce disaster risk. And these people-centered approaches to rebuilding actually can support longer-term collective processes that are involved in risk reduction. This one I'll skip over for this. Basically, as I said, in Turkey, 98% of the housing after the earthquakes in 1999 were rebuilt through contractor processes using government credit. So as you see, this was the majority of the style of housing that was built. 3-story walk-up flats, standardized plans, large-scale resettlements. People were often relocated from the central areas of the city to the outskirts where land was available to rebuild. But there was also something else that happened after the earthquake. I mean, this is this is the norm of reconstruction in Turkey, and it wasn't just in 1999, but this is happening quite frequently after most earthquakes. But something happened in 1999 that was a real civil society movement happened after the earthquake. And this is something that didn't really exist in this country. And I think this is an interesting example because there are many countries in the world that don't have a strong civil society basis, and Turkey is one of these countries. And so this earthquake really forced onto the scene the civil society voice. The government was not able to cope with the major destruction that happened. Groups came forward denouncing bad building practices that had led to all the damage in the earthquake, etc. And so existing organizations, women's solidarity organizations, professional associations of architects, engineers, mountain climbing associations did rescue, and all of these sort of existing organizations played a major role in the recovery, especially in the early months of the recovery. Afterwards, the government sort of resumed control, and sometimes in quite heavy-handed ways. And also, one thing that I'd like to point out is that these local community-based organizations were formed. And in all of the cities, they're called depders, which are basically associations of affected people. And these organizations partnered with other organizations in the area and did all kinds of activities, including the housing for the non-owners. As you said, Joe, this is sort of the second wave, the people who were not involved in those formal reconstruction processes. Livelihoods recovery, especially for women who needed an income right after the earthquake. Assessing building damage, as people didn't trust the government's assessments and things like that. And many of these groups, I'm just doing a study now, many of these groups are 10 years later still involved both in the reconstruction, because some people still don't have houses, but also in activities for disaster risk reduction, which I think is interesting. So basically, I'm just going to quickly highlight two groups that have been involved in this. One is the Association of Volunteers for Solidarity, which is called İMECE in Turkish. And this association was founded after the earthquake, and their major role was to do a community, I would say a people-centered housing project. And this is really the only people-centered housing project that I know of that happened after the earthquake, that was really run by the local community with help, technical, financial support from outside organizations. And they built 57 houses in 3 villages. They interacted, as I said, with other organizations, and it was, in retrospect, a very positive experience for all of those people who were involved in it, and especially for the women who were involved in it, who aren't usually part of these kind of things in Turkey. So this project finished in 2003. They built their 57 houses, and the members had all been rehoused. However, what's happened since then is that this organization has become the basis for other actions within the community. And one thing that's happening right now is that in the area that was affected by the earthquake, there's a large hydroelectric project that's going on to build 5 power plants throughout the valley. And so this organization is spearheading a campaign against these hydroelectric plants. And part of this is because these people already knew each other from working together on the housing project. They had come to develop relationships with external organizations, with media, with the local government, and they've been able to use these in the campaign. And basically, a lot of their arguments are about disaster risk. The fact that one of the plants is to be built right on the fault line. It will take away 90% of the water flowing through the valley, which they use for their hazelnut farming. Deforestation leading to erosion, which is already leading to flooding. And the effect on their livelihood. So this is to show the people who were these sort of organizations that happened right after the earthquake are still very, very active there. And another one is the depder associations, which is the disaster affected peoples associations. And after the earthquake, there were 8 depders that were formed in the 8 different villages or cities that were in the affected region. And they worked together in all kinds of activities, doing enumerations of the people who were living in the camps, helping particular people in violence situations, doing building inspections that they do where they didn't trust the government's building, really sharing information with each other about what the government's plans were and how they could raise awareness about problems that were coming up, etc. And so these are really a federation of associations, which is also something that's not very common in Turkey, is that these neighborhood associations would share information with each other and meet regularly. And their activities have really changed over the years. And we've been interviewing them this summer to find out also what their activities have been, looking 11 years later. And they're still involved in some rebuilding activities. There's a lawsuit going on because they're trying to get land for some people who still haven't got land 10 years later. And also, but I think what is interesting is that they're also engaged in planning activities now with the municipality. There's been new local governments since 2008, and they're now engaging with these local governments in doing planning, and they're very interested in risk and certain projects that are built in risky areas, or to make better spatial planning that takes into account flooding, etc. in the area. And they're also interested in getting together this information hub where municipalities, universities, and organizations can share information across each other, mostly about disaster risk, about planning, about development in the region. So they're quite active also 10 years later. So just to conclude, the earthquake organizations, which were not very common before, these knowledge and contacts have gained in rebuilding, have made more activities in DRR. But the question of scaling up, I mean, these are very small scale activities, and I mean, these are two examples. There are many, many examples that are happening, and I think this is the case in many countries. But what is really needed to scale up more interest in disaster risk reduction, certainly for earthquakes, which is something that events that don't happen all the time. And so I would say two major points here. One is that it needs to be linked to ongoing development initiatives. For example, these hydroelectric dam projects are not really directly related to disasters, but are ongoing development. Urban planning is ongoing development, so risk reduction really needs to be linked to that. And also problems with support of the local government. Certainly this is very much an issue for organizations that are involved in trying to sustain long-term activities in risk reduction. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.